This week, we've had massive fires, hurricanes, floods. We are feeling the impacts of climate change in the United States. This year, we've experienced COVID and the associated economic recession. It's been devastating. And holding all of that, we need some good news. What I want to share with you today is something that was surprising to me and our America's Pledge team. Despite the events of 2020, climate action by states, cities, businesses, and other non-federal entities has continued at pace and in some cases expanded. At this point, almost 70% of US GDP is committed to climate action and the goals of the Paris Agreement. That includes states, tribes, cities, counties, regional associations, businesses and investors, universities and colleges, healthcare institutions, cultural institutions, faith-based entities. The list continues. It's a massive coalition called We Are Still In. The America's Pledge analysis team, made up of Rocky Mountain Institute, University of Maryland, and World Resources Institute, with support from Bloomberg Philanthropies, checked into what's really happening on the ground in the US. We systematically assessed what's going on with electricity, transportation, buildings, and two key parts of industry, HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, and oil and gas methane. Tracking this action, we are more confident today than we were a year ago that non-federal leaders can drive significant emissions reductions. For example, in the heart of the COVID lockdown, Virginia committed to 100% clean electricity. Houston and Dallas announced carbon neutrality goals. And recently, 15 states and DC committed to 100% zero emissions medium and heavy duty vehicles. These leaders know clean energy offers a suite of benefits: climate, economic, health, and equity. And they are following through on the commitments. More than 30 cities have already achieved 100% clean energy. And during COVID, during the first half of this year, we built more wind and solar in the US than we did the first half of last year. This progress is the continuation of more than 3 years of consistent, focused action by this movement. Since the launch of America's Pledge and We Are Still In, the number of electric vehicles on the road has doubled. The number of cities committed to 100% clean energy has quintupled. And 6 million people now live in cities committed to all electric new buildings, which will greatly improve indoor air quality. American public opinion is in favor of clean energy. And the evidence shows we have passed a tipping point in the clean energy transition. That's thanks to the unprecedented leadership of states, cities, businesses, and others. Not stopped by COVID, not stopped by a recession. Now, to build a prosperous society and avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we still have to do more, significantly more. We need federal action. With ambitious action from both federal and non-federal leaders working together, we can get the US on a path to net zero emissions while strengthening the economy and creating jobs. As a start, federal stimulus and recovery investment could enable state and local governments, whose budgets have been hit hard by the pandemic, to address climate and create good-paying jobs. Ultimately, states, cities, businesses, universities, and other leaders are doing more now than ever before to advance climate progress. And remarkably, even a global pandemic and economic recession have not derailed, state, city, and business movement on climate. Moving forward, we can keep and expand this momentum. We can be all in to address the climate crisis. Check out our analysis to learn more at americaspledgeonclimate.com. Thank you.
In 2017, when President Trump announced his intention to pull out of the Paris Agreement, an overwhelming chorus of Americans said, "We're still in."
An all-electric bus fleet by 2025.
To a Los Angeles that has 100% renewable energy.
Increasing the number of residents in the city of Gary who recycle.
Taking our energy generation portfolio to 65 to 75% renewable by the year 2027.
California Governor Jerry Brown and I quickly launched America's Pledge.
The key word is perseverance.
An initiative that measures the efforts of more than 4,000 cities, states, businesses, and other local groups that are committed to driving down emissions.
America's Pledge on climate is so important. It's about more than living up to our responsibilities on the world stage. It's about keeping our word on the world stage.
We have to lead the charge.
We have a better future if we all work together.
We can create a 360 solution for the entire planet.
It's we the people. Working together, we'll get there.
And despite the Trump administration's best efforts to drag us backwards, local leaders are actually accelerating their progress, protecting the climate over the last 4 years.
The state of Maryland is committing to continue to fight climate change.
I am committed to demonstrating that environmental protection and economic prosperity are not mutually exclusive.
To have climate awareness integrated into every aspect of our businesses.
To making climate change a public health issue.
But we're not done yet. This fall, we have the chance to elect a climate leader to the White House who will rejoin the Paris Agreement and honor our commitment to it, and reestablish America as a global leader in the fight against climate change. So let's do it.
Hi, my name is Nate Hultman, and I am the director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland. And I co-lead with Carla Frisch, who you just heard from, the America's Pledge research team. To reflect on these results and help place them in context, it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Mary Nichols is chair of the California Air Resources Board and co-vice chair for America's Pledge. Carl Pope is former executive director of the Sierra Club and also co-vice chair for America's Pledge. Chris Wheat is the director for strategy and city engagement for the American Cities Climate Challenged. And I'm told that Mary Nichols will be joining us in just a few minutes. My first question, therefore, is going to go to Carl Pope. So, Carl, given America's Pledge's role in tracking non-federal engagement and the movement as a whole over the last 3 years, what observations would you share about the progress over these years? And where do you see climate action from states, cities, and businesses going in the near term?
Well, I think one of the fundamental dilemmas is that the climate story was told so long as a story about nation states and what happened in UN conferences that the real story sort of got lost, and it's never quite caught up. The reality has turned out to be, at least in the United States, but I also suspect in many other countries, that really the action is where the energy is, and I'm using energy as a pun, both to mean human energy and climate polluting energy. It is cities and businesses and states that actually control the energy economy. It's not in the United States and in a great many other countries a fundamentally national issue. It's a local issue, and it's being solved locally. And what is remarkable about this year's results is that what has turned out to be true about cities and states and the we are still in the movement, we were motivated by climate, is also turning out to be about markets, which as markets probably don't care about climates. They're kind of just impersonal. But the fact is, energy markets are moving even more rapidly towards decarbonization than I would have guessed a year ago. The reality is, and this is the very, very important finding, We have passed some kind of, we called it a tipping point. You can also call it, we've hit the plateau. We were climbing up towards clean energy. Now we're going downhill. When you get downhill, you tend to go faster and faster. So the news from decarbonization is very good. The news, as we all know from looking out our windows from the climate, is very scary. So we need to do more to get the federal government more engaged. But I think the fundamental truth is, at this point, the clean energy transition is to happen. The faster it happens, the more prosperous society or any given sector within a society will be, and we all should be racing towards the top.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think we'll return to this theme in just a couple of minutes. Now I'd like to turn to Chris Wheat. And in your experience, we've heard a lot from this set of reports, as well as kind of the broader media story, a lot about pioneers in non-federal climate action. The themes that Carl just talked about the community building out new ideas, new policies, new strategies. So, Chris, I'd like to hear more maybe about the unusual suspects. What cities have stepped forward in the wake of the Trump administration's actions to accelerate their own climate action that might have been innovative or surprising? What solutions have you seen that give you heart?
Sure, thanks for the question, Matt, and good to be with you and Carl today. I think in our work in the American Cities Climate Challenge, which is supported by Bloomberg Philanthropies, which is designed to accelerate innovative climate policy in 25 cities around the United States and help those cities ultimately meet the commitments of America's pledge. One of the great things we see is that the innovation often isn't the solution itself. We've known for decades, and the work that you do and Carl have done for a long time, have told us what needs to be done. The question is, do we have the political will to do it? Can we do this with communities? And what are the approaches that we're taking? And I think that what we're really excited about at the Natural Resources Defense Council in our work is the approaches that cities are taking around examples of that. So first, we see a lot of cities focusing around issues of transit. We know the importance of transit in terms of economic development. And in fact, we also know that transit is still critically important to cities today, even in spite of COVID, because we know ultimately it is essential workers, low-income residents, and communities of color that continue to use transit. And so we still see cities like Cincinnati. We see cities like Charlotte and San Antonio continuing to make and push for strong investments in or around transit funding. Secondly, we've still seen action at the legislative level in city councils around strong climate action. So even during the time of the pandemic, we've seen cities like St. Louis pass an aggressive standard to reduce energy use in their own buildings, both public and private. We've seen work happening in Columbus to bulk purchase renewable energy to not only reduce costs, but also increase the amount of wind and solar power in Ohio. We've also seen innovative ways to think about community engagement. It's not enough right now, or it's frankly impossible to have a meeting at a library. And so from providing tablets to low-income residents so they can engage in surveys and other work, to just using plain old postcards and mailing them out so that residents can know what's going on and feel engaged. We're seeing cities really step up to the plate in terms of how they're approaching these issues.
Great. Well, that's all really exciting sort of developments and lots of innovative and creative work happening. And I think that's emblematic of the kind of creativity, innovation, and work happening across the entire economy, from leaders in not only cities, but also businesses, states, and the other organizations that Carla mentioned up front. Maybe we'll riff off of this theme a little bit, and I'll go back to Carl. This year's results are, as you noted, encouraging, and they are encouraging in a time that we're also facing a lot of uncertainty and, in some cases, stress and darkness with a lot of the other crises going on, the linked crises of climate, racial justice, the economy, and COVID. And that provides us some opportunities to reflect on those areas of opportunity. And so I'm going to ask both of you a similar question, or the same question. But when we look at this year's results that Carla, narrated just a couple of minutes ago at the front, are there any elements there that you find particularly either intriguing or surprising or exciting about the work that has come out over the last week that reflects on both looking back at the last few years of climate action from all these actors, or from the robustness of action in light of all these crises? So again, just the question of what if anything, did you find intriguing, surprising, or exciting in some of the actions we've seen over the past, say, 12 months? Maybe Carl, to you first.
Let me pivot off one of the exciting things to identify a challenge. The exciting thing is the fact that there was a global agreement in Kigali in Africa about 2 years ago to actually phase out climate destructive refrigerants. And everybody knew there were solutions. Everybody knew there were better things. The world agreed to do it. The Trump administration didn't agree to have the United States be a part of it. So there was a big question, what was going to happen? Were we going to miss this transition from climate hostile to climate safe refrigerants? The good news is, as we reported in the report, already 16 US states have come forward and said that they are going to move their refrigeration sectors onto climate safe refrigerants. And as a result of that, even in the face of today's thoroughly broken US Congress, we actually have a real live possibility of congressional action to have national behavior. What that illustrates is that most of the conventional wisdom of how long it takes to change an economic sector doesn't apply in the 21st century. We can make rapid change, and in fact, many countries are going to, and the countries that don't will lose. Fundamentally, how fast you can catch a new technological wave is going to determine your economic fate in the 21st century. But there's a risk here. And the risk here is that we don't bring the country as a whole along. And I want to point out what's been happening with the hurricanes and the fires in the last 2 weeks. The fact is, we have an absolutely pathetic national policy with regard to minimizing the risks from these kinds of natural disasters. And we know that with climate change, they're going to get worse. We need to stop being the Americans who wait for something bad to happen, and then we rush to clean it up. We need to become more like the Dutch, where we see something coming 20 years out, and we do something to protect people from it. Community protection needs to become one of the fundamental pieces of the climate movement. And that is something we haven't fully incorporated yet, and I'm going to place a bet. The leadership on that will not come from Washington, however this election comes out. The leadership on that will come from city halls.
Great, thank you, Carl. And I'd also happy to welcome Mary Nichols to the panel. Again, Mary Nichols is the co-vice chair of America's Pledge, but also the chair of the California Air Resources Board. So, Mary, I'm going to let you get your bearings for a second. I'm going to go back to Chris Wheat for the next question. So, Chris, just a reminder, I asked both you and Carl this question of whether there was anything particularly surprising, intriguing, or kind of heartening from the results. And I think one thing, just to you could either answer that, or one thing I'd like to kind of build off on Carl's comment too is if there's anything in the space Carl identified that you've seen also happening in the communities you work with as a part of the American Cities Climate Challenge. what have we seen that links those community resilience development ideas to some of the overall policy development we've seen and highlighted by these reports? So just floor is yours, Chris.
Thanks. Thanks for that. And I definitely agree with Carl around, if we all go back to our American books from high school and college, we were taught this concept that states are the laboratories of innovation on the policy side. Well, it's really cities where that innovation is happening nowadays. And what we're seeing is cities are innovating, often with support from states, often with great folks like Mary at the state level who are providing space for that work, and then allowing cities and states to push. I think on the resilient, I would say two things. First, in terms of the resilient side, the importance of thinking about flooding and the connection that flooding, protecting against flooding, can have to things like green space and gray space. How do we create more park areas for cities and communities, and what is the role that those park areas can ultimately play for flooding? Has tremendous benefits for neighborhoods, tremendous benefits for communities, be it public health, recreation, particularly in a time of COVID. But really, focusing on that. From the mitigation side, one of the I was heartened as we saw some of the social media from America's Pledge. One of the chirons was a bus. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of cities focus on is investment in buses. The technology, particularly around low and zero emissions buses, has improved exponentially over the last few years, be it battery life, comfort, et cetera. Not only, bus is a way of moving and understanding how a city moves and dealing with demographic changes, which can happen a lot faster than putting in a large rail line. And we're seeing cities innovate and say, if we have more people on our buses than on our trains, how are we doing things like creating bus lanes to improve reliability, to make sure that people can actually take the bus and get to work, get to school, get to church or whatnot on time? How are we improving safety at those intersections, not only for the people on the bus, but the people who are biking, the people who are walking, and ultimately for cars as well? And so we're seeing lots of cities starting to get creative around buses and also around micromobility, which is always a hot button issue with cities. I was at a meeting maybe a year and a half ago with lots of senior officials from cities, and I just said the word scooters, and there were a lot of sighs as cities figure out the regulatory pathway here. But we know there's a new future about how people get around, and this has been exacerbated by COVID. So how are cities responding to that? And then what role can that ultimately play in reducing vehicle miles traveled and reducing our dependency on that internal combustion engine?
Fantastic. It's super exciting to hear about all that work going on, and particularly in the transport side, the examples you highlighted. Recognizing there's some challenges to work through, but nevertheless, lots of new possibilities there that are really being implemented today. I'd like to turn to Mary Nichols now. Mary, we've seen from the America's Pledge reports that action, continues across many sectors of the economy, driven by states, cities, businesses, and more. California, as we know, is always been a leader in environmental and climate action. But a notable area, is on electrification and in transport right now. What has made the state so successful in your view, and what can others learn from your success? And as you think about it, what would you say are the most important ingredients to encourage climate leadership from states and cities during this difficult time of COVID-19 and the economic crisis?
Well, I could be facetious and say keep Donald Trump around, because reacting to him and to the complete dereliction on the part of the federal government has definitely been one of the drivers of state action. States and companies, for that matter, have turned to California and said, we'd like to work with you as opposed to the federal government, because nothing is happening at the federal level and they're facing internal demand and requirements to take action. So it has enabled California to overcome the normal resistance on the part of other states or cities, for that matter, to feeling like the big dog California is, telling them what to do, and instead encourage. I hope we've also been good at outreach and offering to help and not being too domineering about all of this. But really, I think it's a question of other jurisdictions saying we want to be part of the action. Let's get together and figure out how we can do it.
Great, and as let me press you a little bit more on this question. There is this kind of moment now where we have to acknowledge a lot of all states and cities and frankly lots of other organizations are pressed because of the COVID and economic challenges that we're facing. Are there any as you're thinking of how you've managed to managed to navigate through this process and continue to drive forward progress? Are there any ways that you can share that others can learn from in terms of navigating through these linked crises?
Well, the old adage that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. So the combination of COVID and the horrific fires that we've been dealing with this year that are worse than ever before. I hate to use the word unprecedented, because somebody, being a lawyer, someone will always come up with a precedent for anything. But the fact is that the constellation of these events has just been horrific, and it's been trying for everybody. But there's also a recognition that we in California have lived through natural disasters of many kinds, and disasters that we ourselves have probably helped to make worse. And so we also have some confidence that we can learn from these things. And I think a simple question of, okay, this is not going to be here forever. What's it going to be like when we get out? How are we going to make sure that after the COVID crisis has passed and it's receded into being just one more threat, and after we've started to rebuild our economy, which, we did just as recently as 2008, we survived what at that point was the worst recession till the Great Recession, since the Great Recession in 1929 and 30s. Now we're having the worst recession since that period of time. So I think being able to take a little bit a longer view and say, we used the period after 2008, among other things, to build a solar industry in California. We didn't build it. We helped bring it in and help to sustain it during hard times. And we ended up in a situation where now, the prices of solar panels have come way down. We have many more opportunities in that area, but we shifted faster than anyone thought we could, away from burning natural gas, or in some cases in Southern California, imported coal, into renewables. And we did it as a part of getting out of the last recession with tremendous help from the federal government. President Obama recognized that this was the place to focus. I think we will do the same thing if we have appropriate leadership in Washington coming out of the COVID crisis.
Thank you for those reflections. And we have just a couple of minutes left on our clock. We're going to go a couple of minutes past 2:30. So I wanted to just do a sort of almost lightning round with our three panelists here. We've been talking a lot about climate action within the U.S. and sort of how we as a community have been responding to the various challenges of our time with frankly heartening degrees of action and commitment from all these leaders and corners of the U.S. But there's the international side as well. A lot of people look to the U.S. for action. They are wondering about, whether the U.S. is, acting on climate. In one or two sentences only, what would you say to the rest of the world about U.S. climate action right now? And I think I'll start with Carl on that one.
Well, I would say to the rest of the world, do not make the mistake the United States has made in the past, and don't count on us making it again. What we have done time and time again is to launch new technologies and let other people market them. The money is in marketing it, not in inventing it. So the fact that you didn't invent a particular technology doesn't mean you can't lead the world in making it and deploying it if you build your domestic market. And I am sincerely hopeful that the United States in the next 5 years will in fact not make that mistake, that we will instead invest in creating the markets for the new clean energy technologies, whether they're electric buses, electric 16-wheelers, or hydrogen-powered chemical factories. I think we will in fact be deploying those things right here in the United States, because bluntly, if we don't, we're going to remain in this recession. And I don't think the American people are going to tolerate that. So the rest of the world should feel America's breath blowing down its back.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to Chris Wheat. Now, Chris, what would you say to the rest of the world about U.S. climate action today?
I would say the same thing that we've been saying for the last few years, that just because Washington, D.C. has abdicated their responsibility to the rest of the world doesn't mean that Sacramento or Chicago or San Jose or Miami has. And that will be true regardless of what happens in November. That the drive and push around climate will continue to happen in city halls and state houses around the country. It will not happen at the federal government. The federal government can be an accelerator, can be a funder, can be a convener and a supporter. But at the end of the day, the work that happens on the ground is going to happen in cities and it's going to happen in states. And that's ultimately where they need to be looking for innovation ideas.
Great. And Mary, we're short on time, but do you have a 1 or 2 sentence response?
Well, ditto to my two colleagues, and add that I believe that climate, for the first time in my lifetime, actually is on the agenda in the presidential election, as well as in many of the potential swing states in the Senate. Without changes in both of those places, we won't see strong federal action. And even with change, frankly, it's going to take a little while to recover from the period of not just inaction, but retrograde action. But don't count the U.S. out.
Great. Fantastic note to end on. Mary Nichols, Carl Pope, and Chris Wheat, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts.